You fall asleep every night beside your worst enemy, and you taught it your name. That voice that punishes you in the dark isn't discipline. It's a law working against you, and someone made sure you'd never question it. There's a violence you rehearse in silence, a ritual that begins when the world goes quiet. The mind reviews your day like a courtroom that already decided the verdict. Guilty again. You call it self-awareness, responsibility, even growth, but listen closer. It's accusation masquerading as guidance. Somewhere along the way, you learned that peace must be earned through pain, that love arrives only after correction. So the subconscious obeyed, imprinting punishment as protection, cruelty as control. And every night just before sleep, you press these words into the deepest part of yourself, where laws are written, not argued. What if that voice was never truth? What if it was an intruder you mistook for authority, and tonight is when it tightens its grip? It learned your habits before it learned your hopes. That voice, sharp, rehearsed, unwavering, did not arrive by accident. It came dressed as responsibility. It wore the uniform of improvement. It spoke with the tone of someone who cares, someone who claims to keep you safe from failure, embarrassment, rejection. And because it sounded reasonable, you never questioned its right to speak. Listen to how it introduces itself. It doesn't shout at first. It sighs. It doesn't condemn outright. It reviews. It says, if you don't point this out, who will? It says, this pain is necessary. It says, I'm only hard on you because the world is harder. And so you nod. You agree. You bow. This is where the contradiction begins, quietly, invisibly, like a crack forming beneath a polished floor. You believe maturity sounds like criticism. You believe awareness must sting. You believe growth requires punishment. So when the inner voice attacks, you interpret it as seriousness. When it humiliates you in memory, you call it honesty. When it withholds peace, you assume you haven't earned it yet. But notice the outcome. Has this voice made you freer? Has it softened your nervous system? Has it expanded your capacity to receive, to create, to rest without guilt? Or has it made you smaller, more cautious, more delayed, more afraid of your own impulses? Here is the unsettling truth most people never slow down enough to feel. The voice that claims to protect you has never protected you from pain. It has only protected itself from being questioned. It operates like an internal enforcer, patrolling your thoughts, correcting your emotions, issuing silent citations for joy that feels undeserved. And every time you comply, every time you accept its judgment as valid, it tightens its jurisdiction. You mistook obedience for wisdom. Think about how it reacts when you try to be gentle with yourself. It scoffs. It calls it laziness. It warns you that compassion will make you weak. It predicts failure if you loosen control, even slightly. That fear it projects, that urgency, that insistence, those are not signs of truth, they are signs of insecurity. Because a voice that is truly aligned with your growth does not need to threaten you into listening, yet this one does. And the most shocking part, the part that makes the chest tighten when you finally see it, is this. You have been offering this voice your most fertile moment of the day, night after night. Just before sleep, when the conscious guard lowers, when the mind stops arguing, when impressions slip past logic and sink directly into the subconscious soil, that is when the enforcer speaks the loudest, reviewing, replaying, reprimanding, and you let it. You believed this was discipline. You believed this was accountability. You believed this pain meant you were sincere about change. But sincerity does not require self-violence. Growth does not demand humiliation. And yet, despite all of that, nothing changes. The same patterns return. The same exhaustion follows effort. The same regret greets the morning. Which leads to the question most people avoid because it feels dangerous to ask, what if the very voice you trust to make you better is the mechanism keeping you exactly where you are? Not because it hates you, but because it was trained to maintain control, not truth. And if that's the case, what happens when you stop obeying it? Not yet. Not tonight. Just feel the tension of the question lingering, because in the silence that follows, something begins to realize it may not be the authority after all. There is a moment, subtle, almost imperceptible, when loyalty turns into captivity. It happens when the voice no longer suggests but decides, when it no longer asks questions but delivers conclusions, when reflection becomes prosecution. You know that moment. It's when you try to rest and feel a wave of unease for no clear reason. It's when joy arrives and is immediately audited. It's when you succeed and feel strangely exposed instead of satisfied. The inner enforcer doesn't only punish failure, it polices pleasure, because pleasure threatens its relevance. If you were allowed to feel peace without self-correction, if you were allowed to feel worthy without review, if you were allowed to sleep without rehearsal of regret, then what would justify its presence? So it adapts. It reframes its cruelty as realism. It labels hope as naivete. It calls softness dangerous. It warns that letting go means losing everything. And you listen, because somewhere deep inside, you were taught that suffering equals sincerity. That if it hurts, it must be working. That if you're exhausted, you must be improving. That if the voice is loud, you must be taking life seriously. But seriousness is not the same as truth. Here is where the collapse begins. Notice how this voice never resolves anything. It never says enough. It never grants absolution. It never closes the case. Every night the trial resets. New evidence, old mistakes, reinterpreted moments, harsh cross-examinations of things you said, didn't say, almost said. And always the same verdict: not enough. That is not guidance, that is conditioning, a system designed to keep you in a permanent state of self-surveillance. And the most devastating realization, the one that makes the stomach drop when it lands, is this: you learn to confuse this surveillance with maturity because it mirrored authority figures from the past. Teachers who corrected before they encouraged, parents who withheld warmth until improvement, cultures that equated worth with performance. So the inner voice borrowed their tone, and you assumed it meant wisdom. But wisdom does not stalk you in your own mind. Wisdom does not humiliate you when no one is watching. Wisdom does not wait until the lights are off to strike. Yet that is exactly when the enforcer is most active, when defenses are down, when the subconscious is open, when repetition becomes law. And so the contradiction tightens. You want peace, but you rehearse punishment. You want change, but you repeat judgment. You want freedom, but you kneel before a voice that has never proven its authority. Still, part of you resists seeing this. Because if this voice is not truth, if it is not protection, if it is not discipline, then what has been guiding your inner world all this time? That question is terrifying, because it suggests you have been obeying something invisible, unexamined, and deeply invested in maintaining its position, not through force, but through familiarity. And familiarity is the most convincing mask of all. So tonight, before anything shifts, before anything is offered, you are left here, standing in the ruins of a belief you once called responsibility, feeling the quiet grief of realizing how long you've been loyal to something that never gave you peace, sensing that beneath the voice, beneath the accusations, beneath the nightly rituals of regret, there is something else waiting, something that has been silent, not because it was weak, but because it was never invited to speak. And as that realization settles, as the old certainty fractures, as the inner enforcer senses, perhaps for the first time, that it is being watched, a deeper question begins to stir in the dark. If this voice is not the law, then what is? There is a law older than language, quieter than thought, and far more obedient than reason. It does not argue. It does not defend itself. It does not care if what you tell it is fair, logical, or cruel. It listens, and it accepts. This law does not live in the daylight mind, the one that explains, justifies, negotiates. It lives beneath that, in the depths where repetition becomes reality, where emotion outranks meaning, where the final tone of the day is taken not as opinion, but as instruction. And this is where the betrayal truly reveals itself, because the subconscious, the silent witness you carry into sleep, does not distinguish between truth and judgment. It only recognizes authority. Whatever speaks last, Whatever carries emotional weight, whatever arrives wrapped in certainty, that becomes the command. Night after night, you have been impressing sentences into this receptive field, not as words, but as frequencies. Guilt, pressed with emotion. Regret, repeated with intensity. Self-accusation, delivered with conviction. And the subconscious, loyal and literal, responds the only way it knows how. It mirrors. It takes the judgment you place upon yourself and reflects it back as experience, not immediately, not dramatically, but faithfully. Subtle delays, missed openings, a constant sense of resistance, opportunities that feel just out of reach. You call it bad timing. You call it fate. You call it life being difficult. But the law has no personality. It only reflects the image impressed upon it. This is why the inner enemy never needs to raise its voice. It only needs repetition, because repetition with emotion is how commands are written in the subconscious. And here is the part that feels almost unbelievable when it first lands. The inner voice you trusted was not creating change. It was creating consistency. Consistency between how you judge yourself and what the subconscious feels obligated to return. The mirror does not decide what to show, it only shows what it has been given. So when the final emotional tone before sleep is accusation, the mirror reflects limitation. When the final feeling is unworthiness, the mirror reflects delay. When the last impression is self-betrayal, the mirror reflects struggle. This is not punishment, it is obedience. And suddenly the pieces rearrange themselves into a pattern that feels both shocking and deeply unsettling. The voice that tears you down at night is not making you stronger, it is issuing instructions. Instructions the subconscious has been following without question, not because it agrees, but because that is its function: to accept, to record, to reflect. And the most painful realization, the one that makes the breath catch, is this: no one needed to sabotage you from the outside. Once this law was in place, you did it for them. Through nightly rituals of self-correction, through emotional rehearsals of regret, through the belief that being hard on yourself meant you were serious about change. But the law does not respond to seriousness. It responds to tone. And the tone you've been delivering, right at the threshold of sleep, has been judgment. Still, this revelation is incomplete, because knowing the law exists is not the same as understanding how deeply it has shaped your inner world. And as this awareness begins to spread, as the inner enforcer senses that its mechanism is being exposed, something tightens, not in fear, but in resistance. Because if this law is real, then silence itself becomes dangerous. And what you do next, or don't do, matters far more than you've ever been told. The law did not arrive with ceremony, no warning, no announcement, no signature required. It entered through repetition, through the quiet accumulation of nights that felt insignificant, forgettable, routine. Because the subconscious is not moved by intensity alone. It is shaped by familiarity. What you feel often enough becomes what it assumes is true. And the inner enemy understood this long before you did. It did not need to convince you all at once. It only needed to be present, consistently, at the moment you were most open. Just before sleep. That threshold, that narrow corridor between waking and dreaming, is where the conscious mind loosens its grip. Logic softens, resistance fades, identity becomes porous, and whatever passes through in that state is not debated, it is absorbed. This is why fleeting thoughts during the day rarely shape your destiny, but the emotional atmosphere you fall asleep in quietly does. The subconscious treats that final impression as directive, not suggestion, not possibility, instruction. This is the invisible law they never taught you, not because it is complex, but because it is too simple, too easy to misuse, too powerful to leave unguarded. So instead of being taught how to impress deliberately, you were taught to review, to correct, to judge. You were encouraged to replay your failures as if repetition were responsibility. But repetition is not reflection when emotion is attached. It is programming. And the inner enforcer became the perfect operator, because it did not sound like an enemy. It sounded like you. Same voice, same vocabulary, same memories, which is why it felt impossible to separate its commands from your identity. Yet here is the fracture point, the moment the old belief begins to fail under its own weight. If the subconscious is a mirror, and mirrors do not argue, then the voice that speaks last is not truth, it is authorship, and authorship has consequences. This is where the awe arrives, not the comforting kind, but the kind that makes your chest feel hollow for a second, because it means your inner world has been governed not by destiny, not by luck, not by hidden enemies, but by unchallenged impressions. It means the law has been faithful this entire time, faithful to your judgments, faithful to your tone, faithful to the emotional signature you press into it each night. And that faithfulness has been mistaken for cruelty. But now something shifts, not resolution but orientation, because once you see the mechanism, you can no longer pretend the voice is harmless, you can no longer dismiss nightly self-talk as meaningless. Silence is no longer neutral, words are no longer casual, emotion is no longer private. Everything impressed at that threshold carries weight, and the inner enemy senses this awareness like a disturbance in the field. It tightens its grip, it grows louder, it warns you not to experiment, it urges you to keep things real, because if you interrupt the pattern even slightly, its authority begins to dissolve. And right here, in this charged understanding, before any method is offered, before any shift is named, you are standing at a rare intersection, where awareness itself becomes an act, where even acknowledging this law is a declaration. And the question hovering in the dark is no longer whether the mechanism exists, but whether you are willing to stop letting it run unattended. Right now, before the mind rushes to interpret, before the old voice tries to reclaim the narrative, notice what is happening inside you. A pause, a subtle suspension, that moment when something ancient has been named and can no longer hide behind habit. This is not a video anymore. This is a threshold. And thresholds respond to declaration. Not loud ones, not dramatic ones, but intentional signals, small acts that interrupt the old frequency and announce a shift in authority. That is what this moment is asking for, not because a platform needs it, but because you do. When you press like, it is not approval, it is agreement. Agreement that the voice you've obeyed does not get to define truth anymore. Agreement that something in you recognizes the law that has been operating in silence. A like is a quiet signal to the subconscious. I see this, I accept this, I am no longer asleep to it. When you comment even a single word, you are doing something far more dangerous to the inner enemy. You are naming it, and what is named loses its camouflage. The enforcer survives in anonymity. It weakens when brought into language. A comment is not for others to read. It is a mark in the field, a statement that says, this pattern has been seen, and it no longer speaks unchallenged. And when you subscribe, that is not loyalty to a channel, that is continuity. It is choosing to remain in this frequency long enough for it to stabilize. It is saying, I am no longer visiting awareness, I am inhabiting it. Because the law you've just encountered does not respond to single insights. It responds to sustained alignment. This is why the inner enemy always rushes you past moments like this. It wants reflection without interruption, awareness without action, understanding without declaration, because declaration changes the emotional tone, and tone is what the subconscious obeys. So if you feel hesitation, if something inside you resists even this small gesture, that is not coincidence. That is the old authority recognizing a challenge. You don't need to fight it, you don't need to silence it. Just don't let it decide. Let this moment be marked, because once marked, the night does not feel the same. And something, deep, observant, patient, has already taken note. Do not try to silence the voice. That is the first instinct, and the most common mistake. Resistance gives it shape. Argument gives it energy. Hatred gives it relevance. The inner enemy does not dissolve when confronted. It dissolves when replaced, because the law you've just uncovered does not respond to force. It responds to impression, and impression does not require struggle. It requires presence. There is a moment each night, brief, fragile, easily missed, when the mind begins to drift. Thoughts lose their edges, images blur, time softens, This is not sleep yet. This is the doorway, and whoever speaks there, writes. The shift begins, not with correcting the voice, but with refusing to let it have the final word. Not by wrestling it into silence, but by offering something else to the subconscious to receive. This is where everything you've been taught about discipline quietly collapses. Because growth here does not come from effort. It comes from selection. Selection of tone, selection of feeling, selection of what is allowed to echo into the night. You are not arguing with the old script. You are changing the channel. Instead of reviewing the day like a crime scene, you introduce a single deliberate suggestion, not a demand, not a correction, not a fantasy. A tone, a sentence that carries safety rather than scrutiny. A feeling that does not need to be justified. Something simple enough to bypass resistance and steady enough to be believed. The subconscious does not need complexity. It needs consistency. So you do not flood it with affirmations. You do not force optimism. You do not chase emotion. You allow one quiet impression to arrive and stay. And this is the part that feels almost too subtle to matter, which is exactly why it works. Because the inner enemy thrives on drama, on urgency, on emotional spikes. Calm is foreign to it, and foreign frequencies are difficult to overwrite. The replacement does not announce itself. It does not argue with the past. It simply occupies the space the voice once filled. And for the first time, the subconscious receives something different at the threshold. Not judgment, not rehearsal, not regret, but a tone that does not punish. Still, this is not resolution. Because the old voice does not disappear quietly. It watches, it waits, it tests. And as this new impression begins to form, as the night feels slightly unfamiliar, a deeper tension emerges. Who decides what speaks in this space? The moment you choose what replaces the voice, something ancient inside you stirs. Not relief, but recognition. Because the inner enemy was never powerful on its own. It was powerful because it was unopposed. It occupied the threshold by default. Now, for the first time, there is a pause before it speaks, a hesitation. You feel it when the mind reaches for the familiar accusation and finds the space already filled, not with noise, not with force, with presence. This is where the shift becomes embodied. You are no longer reacting to the voice. You are deciding the atmosphere. And atmosphere is what the subconscious absorbs. You don't correct the past. You don't analyze the day. You don't negotiate worth. You simply introduce a feeling that implies safety, a tone that suggests permission, a quiet internal posture that says, nothing needs to be fixed right now. That sentence, unspoken or barely formed, is radical because it contradicts the law the inner enemy has been enforcing. It tells the subconscious something it has not heard in a very long time. That rest does not require justification. That peace is not a reward. That silence is allowed. And the subconscious, obedient, neutral, listening, receives it without debate. Still, the old pattern resists. You may feel discomfort, restlessness, a strange urge to do something. That urge is not intuition, it is withdrawal, because the enforcer fed on repetition, on nightly rituals of self-correction, on emotional intensity. Now, denied its routine, it grows uneasy. It whispers warnings. It suggests you're being careless. It hints that something bad will happen if you stop monitoring yourself. But notice something important. It no longer sounds certain. Because certainty requires authority, and authority requires consent. And consent is being quietly withdrawn. This is not victory, not yet. It is a destabilization, a shift from obedience to authorship. The subconscious begins to receive a new signal, not dramatic enough to shock, not loud enough to provoke resistance, but steady enough to matter. And that steadiness begins to accumulate, not overnight, not immediately, but faithfully. Because that is how the law works. Whatever is impressed consistently becomes structure. And as this new tone settles in, as the threshold becomes less hostile, as the night stops feeling like a courtroom, a question begins to form, not in words but in sensation. If you can choose what enters this space, if you can decide what speaks when the guard is down, then who have you been all along? There is a quiet violence in realizing you were never powerless, not the kind that explodes, the kind that rearranges everything. Because once you stop obeying the inner voice by default, once you notice that it waits for permission, it pretended not to need, your identity begins to fracture, not into pieces, but into layers. You see for the first time the difference between what speaks and who decides. And that distinction is dangerous, because it removes the illusion of inevitability. You are no longer the one being corrected. You are the one choosing what is allowed to correct you. Authority shifts, silently, irreversibly. You begin to feel it in small, unsettling ways. Moments when self-accusation arises and something in you does not flinch. Not because you're numb, but because you're no longer identified with the voice. You watch it, and what is watched loses control. This is the rupture. The identity that believed growth required punishment starts to feel outdated. Not wrong, just unnecessary. Because you are no longer trying to become worthy. You are acting from authorship. And authorship carries a different posture. It is not loud, it does not explain itself. It does not beg for permission, it selects. You begin to recognize something that was hidden by years of obedience. The voice never had vision. It only had rules, and rules without vision cannot lead, they can only restrict. So when you stop mistaking restriction for maturity, a different sense of self begins to form. Not inflated, not superior, but grounded. You start to feel less reactive, less apologetic for your own existence, less compelled to justify rest, silence, or ease. And this feels unsettling because discomfort was once proof you were doing it right. Now calm arrives without warning, and calm feels suspicious to an identity built on struggle. The inner enemy responds to this shift by changing tactics. It no longer attacks directly, it questions your authority. Who do you think you are to decide this? What gives you the right to stop correcting yourself? And for a moment, the old reflex almost returns. Almost. But something fundamental has changed, because the question lands differently now. Who are you? You are the one who chooses the final tone. You are the one who decides what is impressed into the subconscious. You are the one who understands the law, not intellectually, but experientially. And that understanding cannot be undone. Still, this identity is not yet stable. It is forming, but not settled. And the tension sharpens. If you are no longer the obedient listener, then what does it mean to fully inhabit this role? It does not arrive as confidence. That would be too obvious, too performative, too close to the old identity wearing a new costume. What arrives instead is something far more destabilizing: permission. Permission without explanation, permission without conditions, permission that does not ask to be understood. And this is where the identity truly ruptures, because the version of you that survived by self-correction does not know how to function without supervision. It was built around vigilance, around anticipation of error, around the belief that safety comes from constant internal monitoring. So when that monitoring softens, when the internal guard steps back, there is a moment of vertigo. A sensation like standing at the edge of something vast without a railing. Not fear exactly, but unfamiliarity. And unfamiliarity feels dangerous to an identity trained in control. Yet beneath that sensation, something else begins to glow. A low, steady heat. Not excitement, not motivation, authority. Not authority over others, but over the inner threshold. You begin to recognize yourself not as the subject of the law, but as its operator. And this recognition carries weight, because it means you are no longer trying to silence the past. You are no longer negotiating with voices that claim seniority. You are choosing what is allowed to shape the subconscious, which means you are choosing what the mirror will reflect. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way you move through the day changes. You don't rush to judge moments as failures or successes. You don't immediately interpret emotion as a problem to solve. You don't feel the same urgency to rehearse regret. Not because you are avoiding responsibility, but because responsibility has shifted location. It no longer lives in accusation. It lives in selection. And that selection happens quietly, without witnesses, without validation, without drama, which is why the inner enemy grows restless again, because it cannot compete with something that does not argue. It cannot overpower a presence. It can only wait, hoping you forget who decides. But forgetting is harder now, because identity has crossed a threshold. You have felt the difference between obedience and authorship, between noise and tone, between being spoken to and speaking last. And once that difference is felt, it cannot be unfelt. Still, this identity is fragile, newly forming, sensitive to disruption, which is why the final test does not come in daylight. It comes at night, when the lights go out, when the body softens, when the old voice prepares to return to its post. And the question hangs, sharp, unresolved, alive, when the threshold opens again. When who will you allow to speak? The room is dark now, not metaphorically, but literally. The kind of dark that quiets the body before it quiets the mind. Breath slows, muscles release, the edges of the day dissolve. And right here, in this narrowing space between thought and sleep, the old voice stirs, not aggressively, not urgently, patiently. It knows this moment. It has ruled this moment for years. It prepares its familiar script, the review, the correction, the subtle tightening in the chest. And for a split second, everything is undecided, because nothing has been resolved. The law still listens, the subconscious still waits, the mirror is still empty. Silence stretches, not peaceful, not hostile, charged. You can feel both possibilities hovering. The old tone, sharp, familiar, heavy with judgment, stands ready, rehearsed, confident in its history. The new silence, unproven, steady, without explanation, does not compete. It does not rush forward. It does not demand space. It simply is. And that is what makes this moment unbearable and sacred. Because no one is watching, no one is guiding, no voice is louder by default anymore. Only one thing matters now. What will be impressed? Not tomorrow. Not after understanding deepens. Not when confidence arrives. Now. As the body drifts, as logic fades, as the subconscious opens like a still lake at night, whatever touches it last will echo. And so the night holds its breath. The inner enemy waits, uncertain for the first time. The silence waits, without urgency. And you, hovering between habit and authorship, feel the weight of a choice that does not announce itself as a choice at all. No lesson follows, no reassurance arrives, no ending is offered. Only this suspended moment, where the law is awake, the mirror is clear, and in something unseen leans closer to receive.